Hi, I'm Mark, and today we need to talk about more Brexit benefits. If shelves remain empty in Great Britain, this regularly makes headlines, and possibly also some glee abroad. Because most of the time, Brexit is not entirely innocent. First, the truck drivers were missing, then the eggs, now the tomatoes. While in Germany there was only a temporary shortage of pasta or toilet paper during the pandemic, the shortage economy in Great Britain is no longer a rarity. Signs reading 3 items per customer have recently been emblazoned on many vegetable shelves in British supermarkets. Experts are already speculating about what could be scarce next. In autumn 21, the petrol stations were temporarily without petrol. A year later, eggs and Christmas turkeys were running out. In addition, there is a shortage of workers everywhere, especially in service jobs and gastronomy. So now the vegetables are also missing, and by the way, not for the first time. After the Brexit rules came into force for the first time, there were also gaps on the shelves. The reasons for the shortage are manifold. There was a shortage of petrol at the time, mainly because after Brexit and the pandemic, there weren't enough truck drivers to drive the fuel from A to B. In eggs and turkeys, massive outbreaks of bird flu have been responsible for killing many animals. And when it comes to vegetables, the British have to wait in line because the harvest was lower than usual due to drought or the weather. Brexit is an amplifier, says the head of the German-British Chamber of Industry and Commerce in London, Ulrich Hoppe, and he did that in an interview with a German press agency. It has become more difficult and expensive to export to the UK. When demand outstrips supply, other countries come first. As far as the shortage of skilled workers is concerned, the hurdles for foreign workers have become higher due to visa rules now. If you ask insiders what could be tied up next, several assumptions come up. The trade association British Retail Consortium considers bottlenecks in olive oil to be possible due to poor harvests in the growing regions, just like the British-German economist Andrew Lee, who teaches at the Baden-Württemberg Cooperative State University and also puts imported cheese on the list of possible endangered goods. If extreme weather events are expected to increase, any shock in the supply chains will hit Great Britain harder than EU countries, is what Lee said in an interview with a German press agency. Britain can then sell more cheddar, but whether that can compensate for the lack of EU cheese imports is questionable, and whether customers only want to eat British cheese is a completely different question. The National Farmers Union also expects that the shortages in tomatoes and cucumbers will remain, as the harvest of the local varieties has become increasingly thin over the years. The farmers assume that the 22 season will turn out to be the one with the lowest yield for tomatoes and cucumbers since records began almost 40 years ago after the final count. The trend is similar for pears and peppers. Food safety in Britain is over, and the government has to take this seriously, said the association's vice president David Exwood. There are several reasons for this, and one of them is Brexit. And as I already said, when I quoted Ulrich Hoppe, he thinks that Britain is always about 10 to 15% more affected than EU countries, because Brexit has increased the risk of supply chains breaking up. And so far, the British government has shunned the idea of at least rejoining the EU single market one day. And in addition, the droughts and other extreme weather events aggravated by climate change mean that farmers have serious problems with their harvests more often. That's why Ulrich Hoppe is so very clear about this. He is the chairman of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce in London, and he knows what he is talking about. And that's why he is absolutely sure that Brexit has increased the risk of supply chains breaking up for Britain. And the Office for Budget Responsibility of the Ministry of Finance also assumed that Brexit will reduce productivity in the country to such an extent that the gross domestic product will be 4% lower in the long term. in the case now, because it's not in the EU anymore. British by its very nature, and Brexit is a long-term problem. And just as it took decades for Britain to see the full benefits of EU memberships, they will continue to talk about the economic impact of Brexit for a very long time. And the reason for this is not least the hard Brexit that ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson forced on the country. Because under his leadership, Great Britain also left the European single market and the customs union. And that with one exception we always talk about, and that's Northern Ireland. In order to avoid a hard border between the region in the north of the Emerald Isle and Ireland, Northern Ireland remained in the EU internal market for goods in accordance with the Brexit agreement. And the EU customs code also remained intact there. And as a result, exports from England, Scotland and Wales to Ireland plummeted in 2021, while Northern Ireland's trade volume with its neighbour to the south rose rapidly. The barriers that Brexit has created in trade between Northern Ireland and Britain, that's what they worked on now with the Windsor framework. But it is not a big problem for Northern Ireland, to be honest. And the reason is that London has been demanding that the EU renegotiate the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Brexit agreement for years now, and now we have the Windsor framework. But the plans of the British migration policy now, that also have to do with Brexit because they think they can do that now, are still causing trouble. A Kulturkampf over a tweet has plunged the BBC now into one of the worst crises in its 100-year history. It began on Tuesday with BBC Sports presenter Gary Lineker's harsh criticism of the Conservative government's current refugee policy on Twitter, for which the former world football star was suspended from British television on Friday. The dispute escalated over the weekend about the limits of expression of opinion in the field of public service broadcasting on the one hand, and being too close to the government on the other. The BBC, also known as the Beeb, has had to shrink its entire English Premier League football coverage to an emergency program because of the mutiny of its presenters, celebrities and sports figures. And now both BBC boss Tim Davie and Richard Sharp, chairman of the station, have to fear for their jobs. Davie had sidelined Lineker himself. Out of solidarity with Lineker, other sports presenters then refused to go on the air. Active coaches and players also showed solidarity with Lineker. This led to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak intervening in the crisis. He asked the broadcaster to resolve the conflict quickly. I hope that the current situation between Gary Lineker and the BBC can be resolved in a timely manner, the Prime Minister said. Lineker is also open to opinions and had compared Interior Secretary Suella Braverman, or Home Secretary Suella Braverman's justification for the draconian measures she announced against illegal migrants with the xenophobia of the Nazis. This is simply an immeasurably cruel policy directed against the weakest in language not unlike that of Germany in the 1930s, Lineker wrote. Braverman presented a bill last week that would oblige the government in London to detain almost all refugees who enter the UK illegally via the English Channel for up to 28 days without a hearing, and to transfer them to a safe third country as soon as reasonably possible. And they mean Rwanda. The United Nations Refugee Organization UNHCR has criticized the measures and doubted that they are compatible with international law. Lineker is a football icon in Britain with 238 goals in more than 460 games. Since the late 1990s, he has presented the most popular BBC sports program Match of the Day, and with a fee of the equivalent of €1.5 million, is the broadcaster's highest paid presenter. Lineker's objection nevertheless triggered a storm of protest in the Conservative camp. The comparison to Nazi slogans in particular has led Tory politicians and Conservative newspapers such as the Daily Mail and the Telegraph to call for the sports star, who works as a freelancer for the BBC, to be fired. On the other hand, Lineker's suspension was heavily criticized on social media as an interference with the right to freedom of expression. The BBC's cowardly decision to withdraw Gary Lineker is an attack on the freedom of expression in the face of political pressure from Tory politicians, is what Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner said. But former BBC director Greg Dyke is also critical of the broadcaster's reaction. There is the impression that the BBC has bowed to pressure from the government, and when the BBC does that, you have a real problem. BBC boss Davey justified the dismissal of a star presenter as violating the BBC's policy, which requires the station's employees to be impartial. However, Lineker is not permanently employed by the BBC and does not work there as a political journalist. He expressed his criticism of refugee policy as a private person and not on the BBC. And Davey, himself a former local Tory leader in London, acknowledged the BBC's guidelines were not clear on Lineker's case and said he wanted to make sure the popular sports presenter was able to get back on the air. However, he refused to resign. The BBC boss isn't the only one under pressure, however. Critics have been calling for Richard Sharp's resignation for weeks. Before taking office, the BBC chairman not only donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party, but also helped former Prime Minister Boris Johnson get an £800,000 loan. Johnson later proposed Sharp as BBC chairman. The events are now being investigated internally and by an appeals committee. But for a second I have to get back to his Nazi comparison. First of all, I have to agree with Lineker there, listening to a lot of this stuff from the Conservative government in recent years, and especially from Priti Patel and now Suella Braverman. The comparison is indeed not wrong when you listen to this. But then we come back to some commentators under the videos, because whenever someone comments something with the Nazis, they immediately come with, "We were the ones fighting against the Nazis and we freed Europe. We won the Second World War," and whatever. First of all, without the Americans, they wouldn't have done anything. But I give them that. But they didn't. The ones writing this didn't. Their fathers, grandfathers, whatever did. And obviously, their sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters obviously have not learned anything from this. This is something we have here in Germany. That's why, unfortunately, especially in Eastern Germany, we have a problem with right-wing extremists as well nowadays again. But it's something that was never gone in the East. I read a lot recently about right-wing extremism in the times of the GDR, so the communist separated country, German country. And that is nothing new. But in general, here in Germany, you hear a lot about the time of the Nazis in school. Sometimes you even get fed up because you hear it that often. But everyone here should be aware what happened there and what strategies were used. And nowadays, populists like Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban are using the same strategies, not to mention Putin. And they are using exactly those strategies. And unfortunately, they are still working. But there's a lot of other things that happened in that time that are happening nowadays. And the language Suella Braverman is using reminds me a lot of that. Not in the whole severity of that time, but she's getting close sometimes. And this government, however they are behaving, the United Kingdom is still a democratic country, even if we can talk a lot about the first past the post system. This government has, especially under Johnson and Liz Truss, had some very authoritarian habits. And the Tory group in Parliament, a lot of them still have that. But the UK as a whole is still a democratic country, so there's different. They have not taken out the other parties as well as it happened in the 1930s in Germany. But still, comparisons like this are often dangerous because people always say, no, nothing can be as bad as the Nazis were in Germany in the 1930s, 1940s. I give you that. But still, some comparisons are still legitimate. It might not be wise to use them because people can always say no one is killing 6 million people there, and it wasn't only Jews, but the majority was Jews, and I don't expect a Holocaust caused by Suella Braverman. That is not what I mean, and that's why it's dangerous to use this comparison. But the language is a language that was used that time, and some measures really have the scent of right-wing extremists like the Nazis. But of course, it will not have the extent like that. Whatever they do, it will not have the extent. But beware of the beginnings. That is something we learned here in Germany. And so you have to stand up if you hear something like this, because that is not correct. This is not humane or and it's definitely not within international law what's coming there in the end. But the people, once again, that are coming with, we defended democracy, we were victorious over the Nazis. No, you weren't. Your fathers and grandfathers and so on were, but you were not. And obviously, those people have not learned anything why their fathers and grandfathers and so on fought there and against what they fought, because they don't recognize this similar thing when they see it. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.